On the outskirts of a small Midwestern town, the cemetery was not a place many lingered after dark. By the year 2000, most people drove past it quickly at night, the tall pines and rows of gravestones casting uneasy shadows across the narrow road. But for 67-year-old Margaret Ellis, the graveyard was simply her workplace. She had been the overnight custodian at Fairview Memorial Cemetery for nearly 7 years, clocking in each evening as the last visitors left, walking the grounds with her keys, her broom, and the quiet calm of a woman used to solitude. Margaret was known for her reliability. She was the kind of person who never missed a shift, who came prepared even on the coldest nights with a thermos of coffee and a wool scarf tucked into her coat. Her family described her as steady, practical, someone who never courted drama. That was why her daughter, Elaine, was immediately alarmed when, on the morning of October 17th, Margaret failed to come home. Her small sedan was still parked in the cemetery lot, neatly positioned in its usual space. Her purse, keys, and jacket were inside. But Margaret herself was gone. When officers first responded, they assumed the situation might be medical. It was late autumn, and nights were cold. Perhaps she had grown disoriented, wandered from the office, or collapsed somewhere on the property. Search teams fanned out across the rows of headstones, combing through the grass, checking beneath trees and into ditches. Nothing. The flashlight beams of officers swept across the grounds until morning, but no sign of Margaret was found. Her workplace had few buildings, a small brick office by the gates, a tool shed, and the looming presence of the old stone mausoleum that stood on the hill. Groundskeepers said they had last seen her near that structure around 2 a.m., sweeping leaves from its steps. That was her routine. She liked the entrance to look clean for families who might visit the next morning. But sometime between then and dawn, she disappeared. Investigators noted how little was out of place. There was no evidence of a struggle, no discarded belongings along the path. Her vehicle remained locked. Inside the office, her cleaning cart was partially stocked, as if she had paused mid-shift. The only odd detail came from a night shift security guard working at a warehouse across the street. Around 3 a.m., he thought he saw the beam of a flashlight moving by the mausoleum longer than usual, then nothing. At the time, he didn't consider it unusual. After all, Margaret often carried a flashlight. But now, with her missing, it became the last possible sighting. When the police called Elaine to the scene, she refused to believe her mother had simply wandered off. Margaret had no history of confusion, no illness that would cause her to forget her way. She was strong-willed, alert, and not the kind of person to leave her responsibilities behind. To Elaine, the fact that her car and belongings were left untouched meant something had happened suddenly, something she couldn't have prepared for. As word spread, townspeople grew uneasy. It wasn't just that a woman had gone missing. It was where. The graveyard, already a place of whispered stories, became the focus of gossip. Some said a stranger must have been watching her. Others imagined a robbery gone wrong. But nothing had been taken. There were no footprints in the dew, no broken locks or shattered glass. Just absence. By the following afternoon, official search efforts intensified. Deputies from the county joined in, along with volunteers from town. They walked in lines across the fields behind the cemetery, checked drainage culverts, and even probed the shallow pond at the far edge of the property. Still nothing. Search dogs were brought in. The handlers reported inconsistent alerts near the cemetery's center, but the animals could not hold a trail long enough to be reliable. Investigators began to wonder if the cold night air had erased her scent, or if she had been taken away quickly, leaving little behind. Margaret's family gathered at the cemetery gates during those days, watching as each search turned up empty. Her son, David, told reporters that his mother's disappearance felt impossible, as though the ground had swallowed her. Elaine stayed quieter, standing apart from the cameras, her eyes fixed on the stone mausoleum at the crest of the hill. She told friends she couldn't shake the feeling that her mother's last moments had been there. But when officers checked the structure, they found its iron doors locked tight, the old padlock rusted, but unbroken. With no sign of tampering, they moved on. By the end of the first week, investigators had few leads. No unusual vehicles had been seen entering or leaving the cemetery lot that night. No signs of forced entry on the grounds. Neighbors living near the cemetery's perimeter reported hearing nothing, No screams, no disturbances, only the usual quiet of an autumn night. The absence of clues only deepened the unease. For the Ellis family, the uncertainty was unbearable. Elaine clutched her mother's purse when police returned it, the leather still smelling faintly of the perfume Margaret always wore. To hold the bag but not the woman who carried it was something she could not reconcile. Each day that passed without answers widened the gap between hope and grief. The town, too, struggled. Margaret wasn't just another name in a file. She was a familiar face at the grocery store, a regular at Sunday services. That someone like her could vanish on her shift, vanish from a place as open and familiar as the cemetery, left people with a chilling thought. If it could happen there, to someone like her, then perhaps it could happen to anyone. By the time the first month closed, the investigation was already cooling. Without evidence of foul play, detectives quietly floated the idea that she may have suffered disorientation, perhaps a stroke or sudden confusion, and wandered beyond the grounds before succumbing to the cold. But the family resisted that theory. Elaine was insistent her mother had not left voluntarily. And with her car still waiting in its usual spot, with her shift unfinished, the idea of her simply vanishing into the night seemed impossible. What no one realized at the time was that the answer had been close, much closer than they could imagine. Margaret had not wandered away into the woods, nor been taken by strangers miles from home. She had disappeared within sight of where she had always been. But in those early days, that possibility seemed unthinkable. The first week after Margaret Ellis vanished was marked by an almost fevered determination. Detectives returned to the cemetery daily, combing through its rows with fresh sets of volunteers. Local deputies brought in search dogs from neighboring counties. The animals were guided through every corner of the property, their handlers waiting for a signal, but the dogs grew restless and inconsistent, pausing in random places, circling trees, even barking toward the mausoleum before veering away. Investigators noted the behavior, but dismissed it as inconclusive. To be thorough, divers were brought to the cemetery's shallow pond, a murky body of water barely waist-deep in most places. They sifted through the mud and weeds, searching for clothing, for remains, for anything that might connect to Margaret. What surfaced were only lost trinkets, an old toy car, a rusted piece of pipe, and a tangle of weeds. Nothing that explained how a 67-year-old woman could vanish without leaving a single trace. Volunteers from town worked shoulder to shoulder with officers, forming search lines across fields that bordered the cemetery. Farmers allowed strangers to trample through their pastures, and hunters led deputies through thickets and brush. Despite their best efforts, the land gave up no answers. Margaret's face stared back from missing person flyers, taped to storefront windows and gas station pumps, her silver hair and calm smile growing familiar in places she had never visited. As days stretched into weeks, the absence of answers began feeding something else: rumors. Fairview was a small community, and with so few facts available, stories began to fill the silence. Some insisted grave robbers had been prowling the cemetery, targeting the mausoleum for valuables. Others whispered about an escaped convict rumored to be hiding in the region that autumn, weaving a narrative that Margaret may have crossed paths with him at the worst possible moment. Each story was more unsettling than the last, and none could be proven. The location itself gave rise to darker speculation. The cemetery was a place already heavy with superstition, and now people swore it had turned sinister. Teenagers whispered of seeing strange lights flickering among the headstones at night, lights they claimed couldn't be explained by lanterns or flashlights. Others reported hearing voices when passing the grounds after dark, low murmurs that cut off the moment they turned to look. Police followed up on some of these accounts, but no evidence was found. Still, the stories spread. For Margaret's family, these rumors added insult to pain. Her daughter Elaine pushed back against them whenever she could, reminding anyone who would listen that her mother was practical and level-headed. She had no connection to anything strange or supernatural, no reason to vanish willingly. Elaine insisted that the only explanation was foul play, but she grew frustrated as the narrative shifted away from her mother's character and toward the cemetery's reputation. To her, the fixation on ghost stories and occult speculation distracted from the very real fact that a woman had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Detectives tried to maintain focus, but even they struggled under the pressure of so much attention. The cemetery had become both a crime scene and a community obsession. People drove by slowly at night, staring through their car windows. Others parked along the roadside just to watch officers work, as though expecting something dramatic to unfold at any moment. Every corner of the cemetery seemed to hold weight now, from the office where Margaret clocked into the silent shadow of the mausoleum on the hill. Inside police headquarters, the caseboard filled with notes and maps. Yet each lead dried up quickly. The truck spotted idling near the cemetery couldn't be traced. Reports of suspicious strangers always turned out to be dead ends. When deputies asked the public for tips, most of what came in was speculation rooted in fear. The absence of evidence made the investigation feel like chasing smoke. Margaret's family held a candlelight vigil outside the cemetery gates 2 weeks after her disappearance. Dozens of neighbors attended, standing quietly with flickering flames, their breath fogging in the night air. Elaine spoke softly about her mother's dedication, her loyalty to her work, her presence as a grandmother. She reminded them all that Margaret was not a story or a legend. She was a person who needed to be found. But even during the vigil, some attendees whispered about shadows they thought they saw moving along the headstones. The detectives noted how the case was spiraling into folklore before their eyes. It was one thing to manage evidence. It was another to manage the stories the community wanted to tell itself. For the investigators, that created a pressing dilemma. The longer the case went unsolved, the more the truth risked being buried beneath rumor. And yet, despite their best efforts, the facts remained painfully thin. As winter approached, the cemetery grew colder, quieter. Leaves collected against the locked gates of the mausoleum where Margaret had last been seen sweeping. The structure loomed over every conversation about her disappearance, its presence both undeniable and unexplored. Police had dismissed it early on, focusing instead on theories of abduction or voluntary disappearance. But Elaine couldn't ignore it. Every time she visited the cemetery, her eyes lingered on the iron doors, convinced of her mother's absence and that the stone buildings were somehow connected. For the town, the case transformed from an active investigation into a lingering shadow. Parents told their children not to walk near the cemetery after dark. Workers who once tended the grounds during the day now rushed to finish before sunset. What had been a quiet resting place was now considered dangerous, cursed even. The story of Margaret Ellis was no longer just a missing person case. It had become a cautionary tale, a mystery that unsettled every corner of Fairview. By the end of the second month, the search teams had dwindled. Flyers grew weathered on telephone poles, their edges curling in the wind. The investigation remained open, but without new evidence, detectives admitted privately that they had little more to go on. Margaret's family clung to hope, but hope became harder to hold each passing day. And while the cemetery still buzzed with whispers of lights and voices, none of them brought the truth any closer. In time, the fear of what might have happened to Margaret began to eclipse the woman herself. But for Elaine, there was no forgetting. She had not vanished from the world. She had vanished from a specific place. And until someone could explain how, Elaine knew she would never stop returning to the gates of Fairview Cemetery, staring at the mausoleum and waiting for the silence to break. As detectives retraced Margaret's final movements, all paths seemed to lead back to the mausoleum. It stood on the cemetery's highest ground, a stone structure built in the early 1900s for one of Fairview's wealthiest families. To most, it was just part of the scenery, a weathered building with heavy iron doors and a nameplate faded by decades of rain. But for investigators, it carried a different weight. The last person who had seen Margaret described her sweeping its steps. If there was a place to start, it was here. In the morning, officers turned their attention to the mausoleum. Its doors were locked with an old but intact padlock. There were no pry marks, no scratches, no bent hinges to suggest anyone had tampered with it. A groundskeeper confirmed that only cemetery management held the keys, and neither reported entering the building in months. From the outside, it seemed secure. Still, the dogs brought in to search the cemetery showed unusual interest. Handlers led them around the mausoleum's perimeter, and twice the animals stopped, noses pressed to the crack where stone met metal. They whined, circled, and then backed away, only to return moments later. It was behavior that caught attention but failed to provide certainty. One handler explained that scents could become trapped or distorted near structures like this, bouncing unpredictably off walls. Investigators noted the inconsistency and ultimately dismissed it. Inside the police command post, discussion of the mausoleum was brief. Detectives reasoned that if Margaret had been inside, the lock would show some sign of disturbance, and there was none. Without cause to force entry, they marked it as unlikely and moved on to other leads. For them, the building was a distraction, an echo chamber for rumor, not a legitimate point of evidence. But for the people of Fairview, the mausoleum was harder to ignore. Its looming presence, tied to the last place Margaret had been seen, made it the natural center of speculation. Visitors left flowers on its steps alongside the missing posters. Teenagers dared one another to touch its doors at night, whispering that it gave off a chill even in summer. And over time, it became less a structure and more a symbol, representing the silence surrounding the case. Elaine noticed it most sharply. She returned often to the cemetery, sitting in her car near her mother's parking spot, staring at the mausoleum in the distance. To her, the dismissal of the building felt premature, almost careless. She believed the dogs had indicated something real, something overlooked. She begged investigators to take another look, to unlock the doors, but each time she was told the same thing. There was no probable cause, no evidence that justified damaging property or disturbing a family crypt. Meanwhile, other theories gained traction. Some insisted Margaret had left the grounds entirely and been taken elsewhere. Others swore she had fallen victim to a passing predator, someone who struck quickly and disappeared. Yet for every theory outside the cemetery, there were those who pulled the focus back to the mausoleum, repeating the same question. Why was it dismissed so easily? The mausoleum's silence grew heavier with each failed lead. People said it looked different now, more foreboding, as if the absence of answers had seeped into its walls. Groundskeepers reported finding flowers and candles left at its steps, tokens from strangers who connected the unsolved mystery to the building without evidence, guided only by intuition and unease. In the months that followed, detectives never formally revisited it. They doubled back to suspects, re-interviewed witnesses, and checked riverbanks miles away. But the mausoleum remained a background presence, closed and untouched. It was easier to treat it as a curiosity than as an avenue of inquiry. Easier to move forward than to circle back to a structure that appeared secure. But the silence it carried continued to feed the case's darker reputation. Residents began to claim they saw Margaret's figure in its shadows, or that they heard faint knocking when passing by late at night. Each story blurred the line between memory and myth until it was difficult to separate what was imagined from what might have been real. For Elaine, though, none of that mattered. To her, the mausoleum wasn't haunted. It was simply unsearched. She admitted to friends that she sometimes thought about breaking the lock herself, just to prove or disprove her instincts. But she never acted. Fear of disrespecting the dead, of facing consequences for trespass, kept her at a distance. Still, her belief never wavered. Her mother's disappearance and the locked building were connected in ways the investigation had refused to consider. As the case drifted into its first cold winter, the mausoleum loomed over the cemetery like an unanswered question. It was the last place Margaret had been seen, yet also the first place ruled out. To investigators, it was background. To the town, it was the heart of the mystery. And to Elaine, it was the only place she couldn't stop thinking about. The search for Margaret widened in the months that followed. New counties, new waterways, even distant connections to other disappearances. But no matter how far the investigation stretched, the image of that locked mausoleum never left the story. It stood in silence, holding nothing on its surface, yet carrying the weight of what everyone feared might be inside. Years later, when the case was long considered cold, people would still return to the cemetery and look up at it, wondering. For some, it was just a relic of the past, a building tied to old rumors. But for others, especially for Elaine, it remained the most obvious clue hiding in plain sight, the one place no one had truly dared to open. As the investigation stretched from weeks into months, the absence of answers created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, theories took hold. With no trace of Margaret Ellis found on the cemetery grounds, no physical evidence of her final movements, the possibilities seemed endless, and the lack of clarity left room for speculation that grew louder with every passing day. One of the earliest theories investigators considered was abduction. The cemetery sat near a two-lane state highway used frequently by truckers traveling between counties. Detectives posited that a driver passing through could have seen Margaret alone in the middle of the night and taken advantage of her isolation. If she had been lured toward a vehicle or forced inside, she could have been transported far from Fairview within minutes. The idea unsettled the community because it meant the woman who had been a fixture of their town might now be gone without a trace, carried off into the anonymity of the highway system. The possibility gained traction when one of Margaret's co-workers came forward. He recalled, vaguely, seeing a dark pickup idling near the cemetery around 2 a.m. on the night she vanished. At the time, he had not thought much of it. Cemeteries occasionally drew curious visitors or teenagers testing their courage. But in hindsight, he could not shake the image. Detectives interviewed him several times, trying to extract details. What was the truck made of? Did he see a driver, any license plate? But his memory provided little more than a shadow. It was enough to fuel suspicion, but not enough to pursue. Another theory rooted itself in geography. A river wound less than half a mile from the back edge of the cemetery. Though shallow in most places, its currents were strong, especially in autumn. Some believed Margaret may have wandered that direction, perhaps chasing an animal or slipping into disorientation and fallen into the water. The river had swallowed victims before. Search teams dragged sections of it in the early weeks, probing with hooks and nets, but nothing surfaced. Still, the theory lingered, especially among residents who struggled to believe foul play could strike so close to home. An accident, however tragic, felt easier to accept than the thought of a predator in their midst. For others, darker possibilities emerged. They whispered that Margaret had been targeted deliberately, perhaps because of where she worked. Rumors swirled about grave robbers or vandals scoping the cemetery and how she might have interrupted them. The setting itself invited speculation. The mausoleum loomed in every retelling, and though police had ruled it out, townspeople were not so convinced. They believed something had happened there, something investigators had either overlooked or chosen not to acknowledge. As detectives worked through each theory, their frustration grew. They logged tips about strangers spotted in town, about transient workers, even about a drifter arrested in a neighboring county. None of it connected back to Margaret. They checked pawn shops for jewelry, believing grave robbery might have escalated into something worse. Again, nothing. They re-interviewed neighbors living near the cemetery's edge, but not a single person reported hearing a scream or seeing a struggle that night. For Margaret's family, the theories felt like shifting sands. Each week brought a new explanation, and each was abandoned as quickly as it surfaced. Elaine, her daughter, hated the idea of abduction, despising the thought of her mother trapped in some unknown place. But she also resisted the accident theory, knowing how sharp and careful her mother had been. Margaret had walked those cemetery paths for years. Elaine couldn't imagine her slipping into a river she knew well. Every theory felt like strangers describing a woman they did not truly know. As time passed, the tone of conversation in town began to change. Where once people spoke of finding Margaret alive, now they speculated about where her body might be. Detectives, too, began to frame their work differently, acknowledging privately that the likelihood of recovery alive was slim. Without evidence, the case hardened into a void, an open file full of what-ifs and incomplete threads. Elaine fought against that void. She met with investigators regularly, pressed for updates, and demanded to know why promising leads fizzled so quickly. Each time, she left with little more than the same silence she already lived with. Theories multiplied outside the station walls, but inside, detectives admitted the trail was cold. Without a body, without a crime scene, their hands were tied. The unresolved nature of the case fed the community's unease. People became more cautious, locking doors earlier, glancing twice at passing vehicles. Parents warned children to steer clear of the cemetery entirely. Though official theories pointed outward, to highways, rivers, strangers, Residents could not escape the fact that Margaret had disappeared from within their town, from a place they all passed daily. Months turned into the first year. Theories continued to surface, each more desperate than the last. Some insisted she had been buried somewhere on the grounds she had once cleaned. Others believed she had been lured away by someone she trusted. But as none could be proved, all became part of the folklore that clung to Fairview Cemetery. The case was still open, technically, but its center was empty, a mystery that gave no ground. For Elaine, each new theory brought less comfort, not more. None explained why her mother's car was still neatly parked, her belongings untouched, her routine interrupted at the mausoleum steps. None gave her the closure she needed. To her, all the speculation in the world meant nothing without evidence, and evidence, it seemed, had disappeared as completely as her mother had. By the time winter passed and spring arrived, the town had adjusted in the only way it knew how. They spoke of Margaret less openly, though her absence lingered everywhere. Flyers still clung to walls, faded and torn, but no new information came. Detectives filed away reports, waiting for something, a confession, a body, a clue. But nothing arrived. Theories had taken hold, but they had also taken over, filling the silence with stories while leaving the truth untouched. For Elaine, it was unbearable. She did not want theories, she wanted answers. And in her mind, there was only one place left that had never been searched, one place where silence had settled deeper than anywhere else, the mausoleum, standing locked and undisturbed on the hill. In the years that followed Margaret Ellis's disappearance, her daughter Elaine became the keeper of the case. Where investigators gradually scaled back their involvement, Elaine refused to let silence swallow her mother's story. She organized vigils in the town square, inviting neighbors to gather with candles, photographs, and prayers. Each vigil carried the same message. Her mother had not simply disappeared. Someone knew something, and until the truth was revealed, she would not stop searching. Elaine gave interviews to local news stations, her voice steady but her eyes hollow. She described her mother as dependable, someone who loved routine and had no reason to vanish willingly. Reporters recorded her words, but the broadcasts grew shorter as time passed, reduced from headline features to small segments buried in evening updates. Still, Elaine spoke whenever asked. For her, every retelling was a way to keep Margaret present, to stop the town from moving on without her. When the official investigation stalled, Elaine turned to private investigators. She spent savings meant for her children's college and refinanced parts of her home to pay for them. One investigator studied the case through the lens of criminal patterns, suggesting Margaret might have been the victim of a serial offender moving through the region at the time. He tied her disappearance loosely to two unsolved cases in neighboring states, both involving older women taken at night. For a moment, Elaine felt she might finally be seeing a thread connect the dots. But the theory unraveled quickly when the other cases were linked to different suspects, leaving Margaret's still isolated. Another investigator focused on the cemetery itself, convinced the answer had to lie within its boundaries. He walked the grounds for hours, taking photographs of pathways, drainage ditches, and the mausoleum. He returned to Elaine with long reports filled with speculation, but no evidence. He too eventually admitted there was little more he could do without fresh leads. For Elaine, the disappointment was crushing, but she continued anyway. She would not allow the case to be abandoned. As the years wore on, the community's attention inevitably faded. Where once neighbors called with updates and offered help, now many avoided the subject altogether, uncomfortable with how little progress had been made. Margaret's name was spoken less often in shops and at church. The vigils drew smaller crowds. Flyers disappeared from windows and were not replaced. To most, the case had simply grown too cold, too distant to hold on to. But for Elaine, it never cooled. If anything, her obsession deepened. She drove to the cemetery weekly, sometimes more, parking near her mother's old spot and staring out at the grounds. She carried flowers with her, but she did not lay them where others expected. She did not place them by a grave because there was none. Instead, she walked them up the hill to the mausoleum, leaving them at its locked iron doors. Over time, groundskeepers began to notice the small bouquets gathered there, a quiet ritual carried out by a daughter who refused to believe the answers lay anywhere else. Elaine often said that the mausoleum felt like the center of gravity for the entire case. It was the last place her mother had been seen, the place where the cadaver dogs had lingered, the place investigators had dismissed too quickly. To her, every visit was a way of pressing against that silence, as though her persistence might one day force the truth into the open. Her family worried about the toll it took on her. They saw the way the search consumed her time, her money, her energy. Friends encouraged her to let go, to accept that she might never have answers, but she rejected the idea outright. To her, acceptance was surrender, and surrender meant her mother would be forgotten. Elaine refused to allow that. In moments of solitude, she admitted the obsession cost her. Birthdays and holidays passed under its shadow. Her children grew up with the image of their grandmother's face on missing posters rather than in family albums. But Elaine carried the weight alone, believing it was her responsibility to keep the case alive when no one else would. She became so closely tied to the story that for many in Fairview, the name Elaine became inseparable from the search. If Margaret was the mystery, Elaine was its voice. And though the town's attention waned, she continued pressing for media coverage, writing letters to officials and demanding that investigators reopen old leads. Sometimes they humored her, revisiting files or conducting brief checks. Each time ended the same: no evidence, no progress, no resolution. But Elaine never let go of her conviction. She told anyone who asked that she believed the answer was still within the cemetery. It was not the highways or the rivers that haunted her. It was the mausoleum. The locked doors had become a symbol of everything withheld from her, everything unanswered. And so, every time she laid her flowers there, she made herself a promise. She would keep returning, year after year, until the truth behind those doors was finally revealed. For the rest of the town, the case faded into memory. People told the story less as a tragedy and more as a piece of local folklore, the kind of tale whispered to newcomers when driving past the cemetery at night. But for Elaine, there was nothing folkloric about it. It was raw, it was immediate, and it was unresolved. And as the seasons changed, her solitary visits to the mausoleum grew more haunting. Each bouquet left against its rusting gates was both a memorial and a question. What lay beyond the silence of those locked doors? As the years stretched into decades, Margaret Ellis's disappearance passed quietly from an active investigation into a cold case. The file was never officially closed, but the pages gathered dust in storage, marked with the words, "Investigators fall back on when time exhausts every lead. Missing, presumed dead." For law enforcement, it became a number in a database. For the town, it became a story told with a shake of the head. But for her daughter Elaine, it never became anything less than an open wound. The cemetery itself bore witness to the passage of time. Fairview Memorial changed ownership more than once, passing from one management company to another. New groundskeepers arrived, cleared brush, replaced broken fences, and then moved on again. But through every change, the mausoleum on the hill remained untouched. Its iron doors, once black, rusted to shades of brown and orange. Its marble facade darkened with soot and moss, streaked by rain. Weeds pushed through the cracks in its steps, and the building grew heavier in the landscape, a silent relic that no one wanted to disturb. Locals spoke less of Margaret by name, but her story lingered in the culture of the town. Teenagers dared each other to walk up to the mausoleum after dark, whispering that the missing woman had been locked inside, that her ghost wandered the grounds with her broom still in hand. Stories of faint knocking sounds or flickering lights were repeated around campfires and at sleepovers, blending her tragedy with the kind of folklore small towns cling to. For those who didn't know her, Margaret became a character in a ghost story rather than a woman who had once lived among them. But for Elaine, the years did not dull the reality of loss. She aged alongside the unanswered case, her hair graying, her children growing, yet every milestone was shadowed by the absence of her mother. She could never visit a grave, never place flowers at a marker with her name. Instead, she continued her ritual at the mausoleum, leaving bouquets at the locked doors, rain or shine. For her, there was no folklore. There was only a locked building that had never been explained. Each time Elaine stood there, she thought about how easily the case had been dismissed. She remembered detectives telling her there was no evidence to justify forcing the doors open. She remembered the cadaver dogs circling and whining. She remembered her own instincts, sharper than the investigators were willing to believe. And she remembered the silence that had followed, a silence that seemed to harden with each passing year. For the police, the case drifted into the background of their workload. Detectives retired, and younger officers inherited boxes of cold files, Margaret's among them. Occasionally, a new detective would skim through the folder, making a note of the odd details: the untouched car, the purse left behind, the flashlight beam seen at the mausoleum. But without new evidence, the file always returned to storage. Other cases took priority. Margaret's name became something mentioned only when older officers reminisced about the mysteries that had never been solved. Meanwhile, Elaine fought to keep her mother from fading into the background. She contacted state agencies, filed requests for reviews, even wrote letters to national organizations that tracked missing persons. Each effort brought polite responses, but no breakthroughs. She gave interviews whenever she could, though the coverage grew shorter with time. By the 15th year, most outlets no longer ran stories on the anniversary of the disappearance. The case was too old, too quiet to command attention. Still, Elaine never stopped returning to the cemetery. Groundskeepers recognized her car and knew her routines. Some admitted feeling uneasy watching her walk alone toward the mausoleum year after year, always carrying flowers, always placing them at the doors. For them, she became part of the landscape too. Her grief as permanent as the headstones. Her visits became more poignant as time wore on. She would stand at the locked gates, her reflection faint in the rusted metal, and speak softly as though her mother might still hear her. She imagined Margaret's voice, imagined what she would say to her grandchildren, imagined what she might have thought about all the years stolen from her. And always she circled back to the same conviction. Her mother had been there all along, never far from where she vanished. The rest of the town, however, had moved on. Children who were not yet born when Margaret disappeared grew up hearing her story as if it were legend, not fact. They laughed nervously as they retold it, never realizing the woman at the center of it had been a real grandmother, a real mother, whose daughter still lived among them. What was folklore to them was grief to Elaine, and that contrast deepened her isolation. 2 decades after her disappearance, the cemetery looked different, but the mausoleum had not changed. Its doors still held fast, the lock still rusting, the silence still unbroken. It was the same silence that had stared back at investigators in the first days, the same silence that had haunted Elaine's steps for 23 years. And while the world around her shifted and aged, Elaine remained anchored to that one unanswered question. She knew the police files were growing dustier by the year. She knew her mother's case was now more a story than an investigation. But she also knew, deep down, that the truth had never left that cemetery. It had been waiting behind those locked doors all along, hidden in plain sight, untouched for decades. By the year 2023, 23 years had passed since Margaret Ellis vanished from Fairview Cemetery. The town had grown, new businesses had opened, old ones had closed, and younger residents often knew her name only from hushed stories told by their parents. But one thing that had not changed was the mausoleum. It remained on the hill, weathered and locked, its stones streaked with black lines of rain, its doors corroded by decades of rust. For some, it was an afterthought. For others, it remained the place where the questions of the past lingered. That summer, the cemetery's new management announced long overdue renovations. Age and neglect had left the grounds in disrepair. Headstones leaned where their bases had cracked, fences sagged against the weight of vines, and the mausoleum itself had begun to show signs of structural weakness. The plan was to restore and secure the cemetery's oldest buildings, both to preserve their history and to prevent accidents. Fairview Memorial, they explained, would be brought back to dignity. For the townspeople, the announcement stirred more than civic pride. It stirred memories. Whispers spread quickly in coffee shops and hardware stores. If the mausoleum was finally to be opened for repairs, what might be found inside? For years, people had spoken of it as if it held something unspoken, a secret that had outlasted every investigation. To some, the renovation was just maintenance. To others, It was the chance for closure. When workers arrived to begin the process, they started with the mausoleum's exterior. Stonemasons examined cracks in the facade, brushing away moss to assess the damage. Laborers cleared weeds from its base. As they worked, they noticed details others had overlooked. The iron doors, coated in rust, bore streaks of orange that traced downward like scars. More troubling was the faint odor escaping from the seams, an earthy, stale scent that lingered even after the wind picked up. It was not strong, but it was enough to unsettle those nearby. They mentioned it quietly to the site manager, who added it to the growing list of concerns. The lock itself, once dismissed as secure, was now little more than a relic. Its body was swollen with corrosion, its mechanism stiff with age. Workers tapped it with tools and watched flakes of rust fall away. It was clear the mausoleum could no longer remain sealed without intervention. The decision was made to bring in locksmiths, not just to cut through the old lock, but to fit new hardware that would preserve the building for years to come. The news traveled fast. Word spread beyond the cemetery grounds and into town. People who had not spoken of the Ellis case in years now found themselves discussing it again. Could this be the moment, they wondered, when the silence would break? The timing felt uncanny. Nearly a quarter-century of locked doors, and now, at last, the chance to look inside. For Elaine, the announcement struck like a lightning bolt. She had spent decades insisting the mausoleum had been overlooked, begging for someone to open it. Now, in her 60s, she found herself standing at the edge of possibility. Her mother had been gone for more than half her life, yet the idea that the answer might still be waiting behind those doors filled her with both dread and fragile hope. She began visiting the cemetery daily, watching the workers from a distance, unwilling to let the moment pass without bearing witness. By the time the locksmiths arrived, anticipation had reached a fever pitch. Residents gathered along the cemetery's fence line, straining for a view of the hill. Workers, too, felt the weight of what they were about to do. What if the building held nothing? What if it held something terrible? The atmosphere was charged with unease. The locksmith studied the lock, debating whether it could be salvaged. But the truth was obvious. It had not functioned properly in years. With deliberate movements, one began cutting into the rusted metal, sparks spitting briefly as the grinder pressed into it. The sound echoed across the cemetery, sharp and final, as though undoing 23 years of silence. When the lock finally gave way, a hush fell over the workers. The air seemed to change. The doors, swollen from years of weather, resisted at first, but as they shifted, the faint odor that had unsettled the crew earlier grew stronger. It was not overwhelming, but it carried the unmistakable weight of something long sealed away. Several workers exchanged glances, unsettled but unwilling to speak. Word spread down the hill and into town almost instantly. People began calling each other, murmuring the same thing. The mausoleum doors were opening. For those who had lived in Fairview long enough to remember, the news reignited every theory, every suspicion. This was the building where Margaret Ellis had last been seen, the building investigators had dismissed, the building Elaine had never stopped believing held the truth. The moment was thick with anticipation. No one yet knew what lay inside. It could be nothing more than dust, collapsed stone, and stale air. But it could also be what Elaine had suspected all along. And as the locksmiths prepared to step back, giving the workers room to push the doors open for the first time in decades, the whispers of renovation gave way to something else entirely. The possibility that the answers to a 23-year-old mystery were finally within reach. When the lock finally broke and the rusted doors gave way, the sound was low and heavy, a groan that seemed to echo against the hillside. Workers braced themselves as they pulled the iron outward, stone dust drifting down from the frame. For the first time in over 2 decades, the mausoleum opened its mouth to the world. What waited inside was silence, thick, stale, and untouched since the day it was last sealed. The first impression was of stillness. Rows of crypts lined the walls, their marble slabs dulled but intact. Dust coated the surfaces, undisturbed by footprints or fresh markings. On the ground, a fine layer of grit covered everything, confirming that no one had walked there in years. To the workers peering inside, it looked like any forgotten burial chamber, somber but unremarkable. But as their eyes adjusted to the dim interior, details began to emerge. Near the far wall, slumped in the shadows, lay objects that didn't belong. A wooden ladder, its rungs splintered and broken, leaned awkwardly against the crypts. Beside it, a flashlight lay cracked, its casing split open as though it had been dropped with force. And draped across the ground was something that at first looked like a discarded cloth or bundle of fabric sunken into the dust. One of the workers stepped closer, his boots crunching softly against the grit. The air inside was heavy, carrying a faint sour odor that spoke of age and decay. He crouched near the fabric, reaching with hesitation. What he touched was not cloth. The material had hardened, stiffened by time, and as his hand moved across it, he felt the unmistakable contours of bone beneath. Panic rippled through the group. What had first appeared to be forgotten debris was no debris at all. It was clothing, mummified by the dry air, still wrapped tightly around skeletal remains. The body was slumped against the wall between two crypts, its posture suggesting collapse rather than arrangement. News spread quickly. The workers backed away, leaving the chamber undisturbed until authorities arrived. By the time investigators entered the mausoleum, the atmosphere around the cemetery had shifted. What had been whispers of curiosity became hushed confirmation. Something had been inside those doors all along. The investigators moved carefully, documenting every detail. The ladder was noted first. Records revealed it had once been stored in the cemetery shed for maintenance, likely brought inside years ago for cleaning or repair work. Its broken state suggested it had been used, perhaps leaned against the crypts before giving way. The flashlight, too, drew attention. Its cracked casing and long dead batteries told a story of desperation, the kind of tool someone would cling to when trapped in darkness. And then there were the remains. The bones were fragile but largely intact, clothed in what had once been a custodian's uniform. The fabric was stiff, faded, but identifiable. Around the shoulders, a jacket clung in tatters. On the feet, shoes sat where they had collapsed, the soles cracked with age. There was no sign of violence, no evidence of binding, nothing to suggest an attack. The position of the body told investigators that whoever this was, they had not been placed there. They had fallen there. Outside, word reached Elaine before officials could even prepare a statement. She had waited 23 years for this moment, and now she stood at the gates, clutching the iron bars as though they might give way too. Her worst fear and her deepest conviction collided in an instant. Her mother had been there all along, within the very structure everyone had dismissed, lying only steps away from where she had vanished. As night fell, the scene inside the mausoleum remained preserved, a team of forensic experts cataloging each detail. They confirmed what the workers already knew. The remains matched the height and build of Margaret Ellis. Though DNA would be needed for certainty, the cracked flashlight and uniform left little doubt. After decades of searching fields, rivers, and highways, the truth had been sitting in silence at the heart of the cemetery. The discovery stunned the community. For years, the mausoleum had been the center of rumor, folklore, and unease. Now it was no longer a myth. It was a tomb that had held not only the dead interred within its crypts, but the secret of a woman who had vanished on her shift. Investigators pieced together a likely scenario. Margaret, performing her duties late that night, may have entered the mausoleum to sweep, repair, or retrieve something. The service ladder had collapsed beneath her. Trapped inside, her flashlight eventually failed, leaving her in complete darkness. The heavy iron doors, swollen with rust, had locked behind her, sealing her fate. For Elaine, the confirmation was both devastating and vindicating. She had begged for years to have the mausoleum searched, begging for the doors to be opened. And now, standing outside, she knew she had been right all along. The truth had not been hidden in distant highways or rivers. It had been locked behind iron gates, a silence mistaken for emptiness. The remains were carried out under the watch of both investigators and the grieving family. Crowds gathered, some in stunned silence, others whispering about how such a simple act, the turning of a key, might have changed everything 2 decades earlier. The cemetery, once a place of rumor, was now undeniably a crime scene of circumstance, a place where neglect and dismissal had stolen 23 years of answers. And as Elaine followed the gurney carrying her mother's remains, she whispered the words she had held onto for decades. "I knew you were here." In the weeks following the discovery inside the mausoleum, the remains were carefully transferred to a state forensic lab. For the family, there was little doubt whose bones they were. The clothing, the shoes, the collapsed flashlight, it all spoke Margaret Ellis's name. But the official confirmation had to come from DNA. Technicians extracted what little genetic material remained from the bone and compared it to samples provided by Elaine and her brother. The results were clear. After 23 years, Margaret was no longer a missing person. She had been found. The forensic analysis did more than confirm identity. It began to tell the story of what had happened inside those walls. There were no fractures consistent with an assault, no trauma suggesting she had been attacked or restrained. There were no indications of strangulation, stabbing, or gunfire. Forensic anthropologists ruled out foul play almost immediately. What they found instead pointed to something more tragic: a woman trapped in silence, undone by circumstance. Investigators pieced together the likely chain of events. The mausoleum had a small, rarely used service access door near the rear, hidden from casual view. Cemetery staff occasionally used it during maintenance to move tools or clean the interior. It was believed Margaret, ever diligent in her work, had entered through that access to sweep leaves, adjust the ladder, or retrieve something left behind. At some point, the heavy iron lock jammed behind her. It was rusted and swollen even then, vulnerable to sticking. When it closed, it was sealed with finality. Trapped inside, Margaret would have found herself in darkness. Her flashlight, recovered, cracked, and long dead, had likely been her only source of light. Investigators imagined her using it to navigate between the crypts, searching for a way out. The broken ladder suggested she had tried to climb or pry her way upward, perhaps hoping to reach ventilation or an escape. But when it collapsed, her options narrowed further. Forensic scientists noted the position of her body, slumped against the wall between two crypts, not arranged, not concealed. She had wandered until exhaustion overcame her. Without food or water, with no means of communication, and with her flashlight battery drained, she had eventually collapsed. In that darkness, time slowed to nothing. Her last moments had been spent only yards from her own car, only steps from where her family had searched. The conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. Margaret had not been murdered, not abducted, not carried off into the unknown. She had been entombed by accident, locked inside the very building she had worked beside night after night. While police searched rivers and highways, while townspeople whispered about kidnappers and ghosts, she had been there, waiting in silence, unseen through corroded doors. For Elaine, the confirmation was both a relief and a torment. Relief that her mother's fate was no longer a mystery, torment that the truth had been so close all along. She replayed the early days of the investigation, the cadaver dogs that had circled the mausoleum, the questions she had asked detectives about opening it, the dismissals she had endured. All of it had been pointing to this moment, and all of it had been ignored. The forensic findings were presented in a final report: cause of death undetermined, but circumstances consistent with confinement and natural decline. There was no evidence of struggle, only evidence of survival attempts. The conclusion was grim, but undeniable. Margaret Ellis had died not because someone chose to harm her, but because a door had closed and never reopened. The town absorbed the news with a mixture of shock and guilt. For years, people had treated the mausoleum as folklore, a symbol of mystery. Now, it was revealed as something far worse, a place where a woman had suffered alone while everyone searched elsewhere. The ghost stories evaporated in the face of reality, replaced by the uncomfortable truth that the answer had been within reach. Had anyone thought to look more closely? The cemetery itself became a different place after the discovery. The mausoleum, once a source of rumor, was now marked as the site of a tragedy. Workers repaired its facade, but its doors no longer carried the same silence. They were a reminder of failure, of oversight, of a community that had walked past the truth for 2 decades. For Elaine, the forensic truth was a form of justice, but one with sharp edges. She had begged investigators to search the mausoleum, had stood in front of those locked doors with flowers year after year. Now she knew her instincts had been right. But she also knew her mother's suffering might have ended differently if someone had listened when it mattered most. That knowledge sat heavier than any theory of foul play ever could. In the end, the case was closed. Margaret's name was removed from the rolls of the missing. Her remains were released to her family for burial, allowing a headstone to finally mark the ground where flowers could be laid. The community came together one last time, not for a vigil or a search, but for a funeral that should have happened 23 years earlier. As the casket lowered, Elaine thought of the mausoleum on the hill, of the silence that had concealed the truth for so long. The investigation had ended, but the weight of those lost years would never fully leave her. Margaret had been found, but she'd been found too late. And yet, even in the heartbreak, there was clarity. The mystery was over. The truth, sealed away in darkness for decades, had at last come into the light. For Margaret Ellis's family, the truth arrived like a double-edged blade. On one side was devastation, the knowledge that she had not vanished into some faraway unknown, but had suffered alone within the walls of a building only steps from where the search had begun. On the other was relief. The relentless wondering, the years of imagining abductions and violence were finally over. Margaret had not been taken by a stranger. She had not been stolen by some sinister plot. She had been there all along, hidden by a locked door and an oversight that spanned 23 years. Elaine felt the weight of both truths as she prepared for her mother's burial. This time there would be a marked grave, a place where flowers could be laid without doubt or hesitation. No more bouquets at the mausoleum gates, no more unanswered prayers at rusted iron doors. For the first time since 2000, she could honor her mother not as a question, but as a person finally brought home. Before the burial, Elaine returned one last time to the mausoleum. She stood at the base of the hill with family beside her, carrying candles into the twilight. It was not an official service, but a vigil of her own making, a way to say goodbye to the place where grief had rooted itself for decades. As the candles flickered against the stone, she thought of the countless visits she had made alone, the years of leaving flowers at doors she believed held the truth. Now she knew she had been right, though the vindication carried little comfort. It was a victory measured in sorrow. For the town, the discovery closed one of its darkest legends, the whispers of ghosts, the stories of abduction, the uneasy warnings to stay away from the cemetery, all dissolved in the face of what the mausoleum had really held. The truth was not otherworldly. It was painfully human. It was a locked door, a broken ladder, and a woman who had simply tried to do her job. As Margaret's remains were lowered into the earth, the family stood in quiet silence. A headstone now bore her name, marking the end of her story in a way that had been denied for over 2 decades. For Elaine, it was not closure. Closure implied the wound had healed. It was peace, carved from silence. A fragile peace that came from finally knowing. The mystery of the graveyard shift had never been about ghosts or killers. It had never been about shadows on the highway or whispers by the river. It was about a simple mistake, a lock that jammed, a door that stayed shut. And in that mistake, 23 years of answers had been stolen. For the family, the vigil at the mausoleum was not just farewell. It was a promise that Margaret Ellis would no longer be remembered as a rumor or a ghost story, but as a woman who had lived, worked, and been loved, and who, at last, had been found.